Patrick O'Sullivan had spent 3 decades investigating financial crimes for the Boston Police Department, so he understood money laundering techniques better than most people. When the 58-year-old retired detective hired accountant David Castellano to manage his finances, he thought his law enforcement background would protect him from financial fraud. But David was using Patrick's expertise against him, exploiting his trust to launder organized crime money through Patrick's identity. This is the story of how a retired police detective used his investigative skills to expose a sophisticated money laundering operation that had been using law enforcement officers' identities to clean millions in mob money. By the time Patrick was finished, federal authorities had dismantled one of the largest organized crime financial networks in New England history. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. You'll want to hear every detail of how Patrick turned his law enforcement experience against the criminals who thought they could exploit his trust and reputation. Patrick O'Sullivan retired from the Boston Police Department in June 2022 after 30 years of service, including 15 years in the Financial Crimes Unit, investigating money laundering, fraud, and organized crime financial operations. At 58, he had accumulated $3.7 million in retirement savings, pension benefits, and real estate investments that required professional financial management. 30 years of chasing other people's money, now I need someone to help me manage my own, Patrick joked to his wife Catherine during their retirement planning discussions. Patrick's law enforcement career had made him naturally suspicious of financial advisors and investment schemes. He had investigated too many cases where professionals had exploited clients' trust to commit fraud or embezzlement. "I want someone who specializes in working with retired cops," Patrick told Catherine. "Someone who understands our pension systems and isn't trying to sell us get-rich-quick schemes." Patrick researched financial advisors who served law enforcement clients and found David Castellano, a CPA who marketed his practice specifically to retired police officers, firefighters, and other public safety professionals. David Castellano, CPA, serving those who served, was his business slogan, and his website featured testimonials from satisfied law enforcement retirees who praised his expertise and trustworthiness. "Mr. O'Sullivan, I understand the unique financial challenges facing retired law enforcement officers," David explained during their initial consultation in July 2022. "Police pensions, deferred compensation plans, and the transition to managing larger investment portfolios require specialized knowledge." "That's exactly what I'm looking for," Patrick replied. "I've spent my career investigating financial crimes, but I'm not an expert in personal financial management." "Your law enforcement background actually makes you an ideal client. You understand the importance of legitimate financial practices and regulatory compliance." David's credentials were impressive: a licensed CPA with 15 years of experience, client references from other retired Boston cops, and apparent expertise in law enforcement retirement planning. "I work with 43 retired law enforcement officers in the Boston area," David explained. "They trust me because I understand their needs and maintain the highest standards of professional ethics." Patrick hired David to manage his retirement investments, tax planning, and financial record-keeping. He provided David with complete access to his financial accounts, tax records, and personal information necessary for comprehensive financial management. "David, I'm trusting you with everything I've worked 30 years to accumulate," Patrick said as he signed the financial management agreements. "Mr. O'Sullivan, your trust is sacred to me. I'll treat your finances with the same care and integrity you brought to law enforcement." Patrick felt confident that his law enforcement background and David's apparent specialization in serving police officers would protect him from the financial fraud he had spent decades investigating. He was completely wrong. Over the first 6 months of their professional relationship, David Castellano appeared to provide excellent financial management services. Patrick's investment returns were strong, his tax planning was sophisticated, and David's regular reports showed careful attention to detail and conservative investment strategies. "Catherine, David is doing exactly what I hoped," Patrick reported to his wife in early 2023. "My investments are performing well, and he's handling all the paperwork and tax compliance that I don't want to deal with." "You seem much more relaxed about money since hiring him. It's nice to have a professional I trust, managing the details while I focus on enjoying retirement." David's requests for additional financial information seemed reasonable and professional. He asked for Patrick's social security number, banking information, and complete tax records to optimize investment strategies and ensure proper tax planning. "Mr. O'Sullivan, I need comprehensive financial information to develop the most effective investment and tax strategies," David explained. "The more information I have, the better I can serve your interests." "Take whatever you need. I want you to have complete visibility into my financial situation. David also requested Patrick's permission to open new investment accounts and financial instruments that would provide better returns and tax advantages. I'm recommending we establish some additional business entities for tax optimization, David suggested in March 2023. LLCs and partnerships can provide significant tax benefits for retirement income management. I don't know much about business entities for personal investing. That's why you hired me. These structures are completely legitimate and commonly used by high-net-worth retirees. They'll reduce your tax burden while providing more investment flexibility. Patrick authorized David to establish business entities and investment accounts that David claimed would optimize his retirement financial management. What Patrick didn't realize was that David was using his identity and clean law enforcement background to create a sophisticated money laundering network for organized crime families. The business entities David established in Patrick's name weren't for legitimate investment purposes. They were shell companies designed to clean mob money through a retired police detective's impeccable reputation. Patrick's first indication that something was wrong came in April 2023, when he received mail from banks and financial institutions he'd never heard of. Letters addressed to Patrick O'Sullivan Enterprises and O'Sullivan Financial Services arrived at his home, referring to accounts and business activities he didn't recognize. "Catherine, did you see this letter from First National Business Bank?" Patrick asked his wife one morning. "They're thanking me for opening a commercial account, but I've never been to this bank. Maybe it's related to those investment accounts David set up." He mentioned investment accounts, not commercial banking, and why would they use Patrick O'Sullivan Enterprises as the business name? Patrick called David to ask about the unfamiliar correspondence. "Mr. O'Sullivan, those are part of the business entities we established for tax optimization," David explained. "The LLCs and partnerships require separate banking relationships for legal compliance. But I didn't authorize any business names like Patrick O'Sullivan Enterprises. Those are just the legal names for the entities. It's standard practice to use variations of the owner's name for business registration." Patrick accepted David's explanation, but his law enforcement instincts were beginning to alert him that something didn't feel right about the complexity and opacity of his supposedly simple retirement financial management. The second suspicious sign came when Patrick received credit monitoring alerts about new accounts and credit inquiries he hadn't authorized. "David, my credit monitoring service shows someone has been opening accounts and checking my credit. Do you know anything about this?" "Yes, that's part of establishing the investment entities. We need to verify creditworthiness for certain financial instruments and banking relationships." "How many accounts are we talking about?" "Just what's necessary for optimal financial management. I handle all the details, so you don't have to worry about the paperwork." But Patrick's police detective training had taught him that excessive complexity in financial arrangements was often a sign of fraudulent activity. Legitimate financial management shouldn't require dozens of accounts and constant credit inquiries. The third warning sign was the most concerning. Patrick began receiving tax documents for business income he'd never earned. In January 2024, Patrick received a package from David containing tax documents for the previous year. Among the expected investment income reports were 1099 forms showing substantial business income from companies and activities Patrick had never heard of. "David, these tax documents show I earned $340,000 in business income last year," Patrick said during their phone call. "What businesses are these referring to?" "Those are from the investment entities we established. The business income represents returns from the LLCs and partnerships." "But I thought those were just tax optimization structures. Why am I showing business income instead of investment returns?" "The entities generate business income rather than investment income for tax purposes. It's more tax efficient for your overall financial situation." Patrick examined the 1099 forms more closely and noticed they came from companies with names like New England Construction Services, Atlantic Import Company, and Boston Commercial Properties. Businesses that sounded nothing like investment management or retirement planning. "David, these companies don't sound like investment firms. What kind of business am I supposedly involved in?" "They're diversified business investments. The entities you own participate in various legitimate business activities that generate income." "I never authorized investing in construction companies or import businesses." "Mr. O'Sullivan, you gave me discretionary authority to make investment decisions on your behalf. These are all legitimate business investments designed to optimize your returns." but Patrick's investigative experience told him that something was fundamentally wrong. The business names, income amounts, and complexity of the arrangements bore no resemblance to the conservative retirement planning he had requested. That evening, Patrick began conducting his own investigation into the business entities and accounts that had been established in his name. What he discovered would expose one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations in New England organized crime history. Patrick approached his investigation of David Castellano's activities with the same systematic methodology he had used during 30 years of financial crime investigations. He began by mapping all the accounts, entities, and business relationships that had been established using his identity. Using his law enforcement contacts and investigative resources, Patrick requested comprehensive background checks on David Castellano and the businesses that were supposedly generating income under Patrick's name. "Lieutenant Morrison, I need a favor," Patrick called his former partner in the financial crimes unit. "Can you run some background checks on a CPA named David Castellano and some businesses that might be connected to organized crime?" "Patrick, what are you into?" "I think my accountant might be using my identity for money laundering. I need to know if this guy has connections to the families we used to investigate." Lieutenant Morrison's background check on David Castellano revealed disturbing connections to organized crime figures that Patrick had investigated during his law enforcement career. "Patrick, your accountant David Castellano has family connections to the Torino crime family," Morrison reported. "His uncle Vincent Castellano is a known associate of Anthony Torino, and David's been on our radar for potential money laundering activities." "Why wasn't he charged?" "We could never prove direct criminal activity, but he's been providing financial services to known organized crime figures for at least 10 years. The businesses generating income under Patrick's name were also connected to organized crime operations. New England Construction Services was a known front company for the Torino family's illegal gambling operations. Atlantic Import Company was connected to drug trafficking investigations. Boston Commercial Properties was suspected of being a money laundering vehicle. "Patrick, these companies are all connected to organized crime families we've been investigating," Morrison explained. "If your name is associated with them, someone's been using your identity to launder mob money." Patrick realized that David had been systematically using his law enforcement background and clean reputation to establish a money laundering network that would be nearly impossible to detect through normal regulatory oversight. A retired police detective with no criminal background and legitimate income sources is the perfect cover for cleaning dirty money, Patrick told Catherine when he explained what he had discovered. "How much money are we talking about?" "Based on the tax documents, David has laundered at least $2 million through entities established in my name over the past 18 months. Patrick understood that he needed to involve federal authorities immediately, both to protect himself from criminal liability and to gather evidence against David's organized crime network. Patrick contacted FBI Organized Crime Task Force agent Maria Santos, whom he had worked with during several joint investigations between Boston police and federal authorities. "Agent Santos, I need to report that my identity is being used for organized crime money laundering," Patrick explained during their meeting. "My accountant has been using my name to clean mob money." "Patrick, this is serious. If your identity is connected to organized crime financial operations, you could face federal charges unless we can prove you were an unwitting victim." Patrick provided Agent Santos with all the documentation he had gathered during his investigation, including the suspicious tax documents, business entity information, and evidence of David's organized crime connections. "Agent Santos, I spent 15 years investigating exactly these kinds of money laundering operations. I know how they work, and I can help you gather evidence against David's network. We'll need to move carefully. If David suspects he's being investigated, he could destroy evidence or alert his organized crime associates." Federal authorities opened a joint investigation involving the FBI Organized Crime Task Force, IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Patrick agreed to cooperate fully while continuing his relationship with David to gather additional evidence. "Mr. O'Sullivan, we need you to maintain normal contact with David while we install surveillance equipment and monitor his financial activities," Agent Santos explained. "Your law enforcement background makes you uniquely qualified to help gather evidence." The investigation required Patrick to continue meeting with David while wearing recording devices and asking questions designed to elicit admissions about the money laundering operation. "David, I'm concerned about the tax implications of all this business income," Patrick said during a recorded meeting. "Are you sure all these business activities are legitimate?" Mr. O'Sullivan, I guarantee everything we're doing is completely legal. The business income comes from legitimate commercial activities. But some of these company names don't sound like typical investments. They're diversified business investments. The more diverse your income sources, the more stable your financial position. The recorded conversations captured David making false statements about the nature of the business activities, while avoiding direct admissions about money laundering. But federal surveillance of David's activities revealed evidence of systematic money laundering that extended far beyond Patrick's individual case. FBI surveillance of David Castellano revealed that he was operating a sophisticated money laundering network serving multiple organized crime families throughout New England. Patrick's identity was just one of several law enforcement retirees whose backgrounds were being exploited for criminal financial operations. David has been using at least 12 different retired police officers' identities for money laundering, Agent Santos reported after reviewing surveillance evidence. He specifically targets law enforcement retirees because their clean backgrounds provide perfect cover for organized crime financial activities. The investigation revealed that David's money laundering network had processed more than $47 million in organized crime proceeds over 5 years, using the identities of retired law enforcement officers from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. David advertises his services to retired cops, specifically because he needs clean identities for money laundering, Agent Santos explained. He provides legitimate financial services to some clients while using others for criminal operations. The surveillance also captured evidence of David's direct cooperation with organized crime figures, including meetings with Vincent Torino and other known mob associates to coordinate money laundering activities. We recorded David meeting with Vincent Torino to discuss expanding the money laundering operation to include more law enforcement retirees, Agent Santos reported. They're planning to recruit retired federal agents and military officers for additional criminal financial activities. Federal authorities realized they were investigating one of the most sophisticated organized crime financial operations in New England history, with David serving as the key financial coordinator for multiple crime families. The investigation expanded to include RICO charges against the entire criminal network, with David facing potential life imprisonment for his role in the organized crime enterprise. Patrick, your cooperation has helped us expose a major organized crime financial operation, Agent Santos explained. David's money laundering network was generating millions in illegal income for multiple crime families. But gathering sufficient evidence for successful prosecution required additional undercover operations and coordinated surveillance of the entire criminal network. Federal authorities developed a comprehensive sting operation designed to capture evidence of David's money laundering activities while gathering intelligence about the broader organized crime network he served. Patrick agreed to participate in controlled meetings with David while wearing sophisticated recording equipment that would document the money laundering operation and David's criminal associations. Mr. Castellano, I'm concerned about some of the business activities generating income under my name, Patrick said during a recorded meeting arranged by federal authorities. I need to understand exactly what businesses I'm supposedly involved in. Mr. O'Sullivan, you don't need to worry about operational details. I handle all the business management, and you receive the financial benefits. But as a former police officer, I need to make sure I'm not associated with anything that could be illegal. Everything we do is completely legitimate. The business investments are all legal commercial activities. The recording captured David making false statements about the legitimacy of the money laundering operation while attempting to reassure Patrick that no illegal activities were involved. Federal surveillance teams also monitored David's meetings with organized crime figures, capturing evidence of coordination between the accountant and mob associates about expanding their money laundering capabilities. We recorded David meeting with Anthony Torino himself to discuss using more law enforcement identities for money laundering, Agent Santos reported. They're planning to expand nationally by recruiting retired federal agents and military officers. The surveillance evidence demonstrated that David was a key financial coordinator for a major organized crime enterprise that had been operating across multiple states for several years. But the most damning evidence came when federal agents discovered David's detailed records of money laundering activities, including spreadsheets showing how much dirty money had been cleaned through each retired law enforcement officer's identity. David kept meticulous records of his criminal activities, Agent Santos showed him. He has spreadsheets showing that he laundered $3.2 million through your identity alone over 18 months. The evidence was sufficient for federal authorities to obtain arrest warrants for David and 17 associates in his organized crime network. The federal raids on David Castellano's money laundering network occurred simultaneously across 3 states, with coordinated arrests of accountants, organized crime figures, and associates involved in the financial operation. David Castellano, you're under arrest for money laundering, organized crime conspiracy, and identity theft, FBI agents announced as they entered his office at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The search of David's office revealed extensive evidence of the money laundering operation, including client files documenting systematic identity theft of law enforcement retirees, financial records showing $47 million in laundered organized crime proceeds, communications with mob figures coordinating criminal financial activities, spreadsheets tracking money laundering activities by victim identity. David had systematized his criminal operation, Agent Santos explained during a press conference. He developed specific techniques for exploiting law enforcement retirees' identities while maintaining the appearance of legitimate financial services. Simultaneous raids on organized crime figures throughout New England netted 17 arrests, including Vincent Torino, Anthony Torino, and multiple associates involved in the money laundering network. This investigation has dismantled one of the most sophisticated organized crime financial operations in New England history, announced U.S. Attorney Patricia Williams. David Castellano used his professional credentials to provide essential money laundering services to multiple crime families. David faced federal charges including money laundering, 23 counts, RICO conspiracy, organized crime enterprise, identity theft, 47 counts, wire fraud, 31 counts, tax fraud, 15 counts. The charges carried potential sentences totaling more than 300 years in federal prison. Patrick's cooperation with the investigation had been crucial for gathering evidence and understanding the scope of David's criminal operations. Patrick O'Sullivan's law enforcement expertise and willingness to cooperate made this investigation possible, Agent Santos explained. His understanding of financial crimes helped us gather evidence that led to dismantling this entire criminal network. David Castellano's trial began 14 months after his arrest, with federal prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence of his systematic money laundering operation and organized crime connections. David Castellano exploited the trust and reputation of retired law enforcement officers to provide essential financial services to organized crime families, Prosecutor James Rodriguez argued during opening statements. He perverted his professional credentials to facilitate criminal enterprises that generated millions in illegal income. Patrick testified as the key prosecution witness, describing how David had systematically exploited his identity and law enforcement background for money laundering purposes. David used my clean record and reputation as a police detective to make his money laundering operation appear legitimate, Patrick told the jury. He specifically targeted law enforcement retirees because our backgrounds provided perfect cover for organized crime financial activities. The prosecution presented recorded conversations between Patrick and David that captured the accountant making false statements about the legitimacy of his business operations while attempting to conceal the money laundering activities. Surveillance evidence showed David meeting with organized crime figures to coordinate money laundering operations and discuss expanding their use of law enforcement identities for criminal financial purposes. David Castellano wasn't just providing accounting services, Prosecutor Rodriguez explained to the jury. He was a key financial coordinator for multiple organized crime families, using retired police officers' identities to clean dirty money. Financial experts testified that David's operation had laundered $47 million in organized crime proceeds over 5 years, with Patrick's identity used to clean $3.2 million in illegal income. The systematic nature of David's money laundering operation demonstrates sophisticated criminal organization, explained FBI financial crimes expert Dr. Jennifer Walsh. He developed specific techniques for exploiting law enforcement retirees while avoiding detection. David's defense attorney attempted to minimize his role by characterizing him as a legitimate accountant who had been coerced by organized crime figures. My client was threatened by dangerous criminals who forced him to provide financial services, defense attorney Patricia Stevens argued. David Castellano was a victim of organized crime intimidation, not a willing participant. But the evidence against David was overwhelming. The surveillance recording showed him actively coordinating with mob figures and expressing enthusiasm for expanding the money laundering operation. The financial records demonstrated systematic criminal activity over multiple years, with David maintaining detailed documentation of his money laundering services. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against David and his criminal associates. David Castellano was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $8.7 million in restitution to victims and forfeited assets. His CPA license was permanently revoked, and he faced lifetime prohibition from providing financial services. Patrick filed civil lawsuits against David Castellano, his accounting firm, and the professional liability insurance companies that had covered his fraudulent financial services. David Castellano's systematic identity theft and money laundering caused substantial damage to Patrick O'Sullivan's reputation and financial security, Patrick's attorney explained. The use of his law enforcement background for organized crime activities created serious legal and financial liability. The professional liability insurance companies initially attempted to deny coverage, arguing that David's criminal activities weren't covered under accounting malpractice policies. Insurance policies don't cover intentional criminal behavior, argued defense attorney James Patterson. But Patrick's legal team successfully demonstrated that the insurance companies had benefited from David's criminal activities by collecting premiums, while he generated artificial client volume through identity theft. These companies profited from David's systematic fraud while he used their coverage to provide legitimacy for his criminal operations, Patrick's attorney argued. The insurance settlements totaled $4.2 million, compensating Patrick and other law enforcement victims for identity theft damages, financial losses, and legal expenses. David's personal assets, including his accounting practice, real estate investments, and financial accounts, were liquidated to pay additional restitution to victims. Patrick recovered approximately $380,000 in direct compensation for the identity theft and money laundering activities, plus additional damages for legal expenses and credit monitoring services. The organized crime figures involved in the money laundering network faced separate asset forfeiture proceedings that recovered millions in criminal proceeds for victim compensation. The civil recovery process helped restore Patrick's financial security while providing restitution for other law enforcement victims, explained victim rights advocate Margaret Foster. But the most important aspect of Patrick's victory was the systematic changes his case inspired in professional regulation and law enforcement protection. Patrick's case led to comprehensive reforms in Massachusetts' professional regulation and identity protection for law enforcement personnel. The O'Sullivan Law Enforcement Protection Act was passed by the state legislature, creating enhanced oversight of financial professionals serving law enforcement clients. Patrick O'Sullivan's case exposed how criminals exploit law enforcement officers' trust and reputation, explained Massachusetts Senator Patricia Williams, who sponsored the legislation. We needed stronger protections for retired officers who are particularly vulnerable to professional exploitation. The new law required enhanced background checks for financial professionals serving law enforcement clients, mandatory reporting of suspicious financial activities involving law enforcement identities, stronger penalties for professionals who exploit law enforcement clients, regular audits of financial practices serving law enforcement personnel. The Massachusetts Board of Public Accountancy implemented new procedures for investigating accountants suspected of criminal activities and established a hotline for reporting suspicious financial. David Castellano's money laundering operation showed us that professional criminals specifically target law enforcement clients, explained Board Director Michael Torres. We needed better systems for detecting and preventing this type of systematic exploitation. Federal authorities used Patrick's case to develop new protocols for investigating organized crime financial operations and protecting law enforcement personnel from identity theft. The O'Sullivan investigation taught us that organized crime increasingly targets law enforcement officers' identities for money laundering purposes, explained FBI Organized Crime Director Sarah Kim. We developed new protection and investigation techniques based on patterns Patrick identified. Professional liability insurance companies implemented new procedures for detecting criminal activities by covered professionals and protecting clients from systematic exploitation. Patrick's case showed us that professional criminals can operate under legitimate insurance coverage while conducting systematic fraud, explained insurance industry analyst Dr. Jennifer Walsh. We needed better monitoring systems to detect criminal activities. Patrick's experience became required study material in law enforcement academies, accounting programs, and organized crime investigation courses nationwide. His systematic approach to investigating David's money laundering operation provided a template for recognizing similar schemes. The O'Sullivan case demonstrates how law enforcement officers can become targets for organized crime exploitation, explained criminal justice educator Dr. Robert Chen at Boston University. Patrick's investigation techniques are now taught to law enforcement personnel as examples of financial crime recognition. Professional organizations invited Patrick to speak about his experience and educate financial professionals about the importance of ethical client relationships and the dangers of organized crime infiltration. Patrick O'Sullivan's story reminds us that professional credentials can be perverted for criminal purposes, Patrick explained during a presentation to the Massachusetts Society of CPAs. Financial professionals must be vigilant about organized crime attempts to exploit their services. Federal law enforcement agencies incorporated lessons from Patrick's case into their training programs for investigating organized crime financial operations. The O'Sullivan investigation showed us sophisticated techniques that organized crime uses to exploit legitimate professional relationships, explained FBI training coordinator Dr. Patricia Martinez. Patrick's case has become standard study material for organized crime financial investigations. Consumer advocacy organizations used Patrick's experience to educate retired law enforcement officers about protecting themselves from professional exploitation and identity theft. Patrick proved that even experienced law enforcement officers can be targeted for sophisticated financial fraud, explained Elder Rights Coalition Director Margaret Foster. His case helps other retired officers recognize warning signs of professional exploitation. The ongoing educational impact of Patrick's case continued expanding as more institutions recognized the value of his experience for training professionals and protecting vulnerable populations. 3 years after exposing David's money laundering operation, Patrick had transformed his experience into advocacy work that protected other law enforcement personnel from similar criminal exploitation. David thought my law enforcement background would make me a passive victim who wouldn't question his authority, Patrick reflected during a recent interview. He underestimated what 30 years of investigating financial crimes had taught me about recognizing systematic fraud. Patrick established the O'Sullivan Foundation for Law Enforcement Protection, which funds advocacy services for law enforcement personnel victimized by professional exploitation and supports research into preventing organized crime infiltration of legitimate services. I want to ensure that no other law enforcement officer experiences what David put me through, Patrick explained during the Foundation's launch. Our clean backgrounds shouldn't make us targets for organized crime exploitation. The Foundation had helped more than 200 law enforcement personnel recover from various forms of professional exploitation, providing legal assistance, financial recovery services, and educational resources. Patrick's personal recovery had progressed significantly through his advocacy work and the justice achieved through David's prosecution and the dismantling of the organized crime network. Exposing David's criminal operation gave me a sense of purpose in retirement, Patrick reflected. Instead of being a victim of organized crime, I became a protector of other law enforcement personnel. Patrick had also developed meaningful relationships with other organized crime victims and law enforcement advocacy organizations, creating a support network that extended far beyond his individual experience. Patrick showed all of us that we could fight back against organized crime even when they exploit our trust, said Thomas Chen, another financial fraud victim who worked with the Foundation. His courage and expertise gave us tools to protect ourselves. David Castellano remained in federal prison, serving his 25-year sentence with multiple appeals unsuccessful. The organized crime network he had served was completely dismantled, with associates serving sentences across multiple federal districts. Patrick's financial security had been completely restored through the civil settlements and asset recovery, with enhanced protection systems preventing future identity theft and exploitation. Patrick's systematic approach to investigating David's money laundering operation had created lasting changes in how organized crime financial schemes are detected and prosecuted across the United States. Federal authorities had incorporated lessons from Patrick's investigation into their standard protocols for examining organized crime financial operations. The O'Sullivan method of systematic evidence gathering had become required training for FBI organized crime investigators nationwide. Patrick O'Sullivan's investigative techniques revolutionized how we approach organized crime financial cases, explained FBI Organized Crime Director Sarah Kim during a congressional hearing on money laundering prevention. His law enforcement expertise, combined with personal victimization, provided unique insights into criminal operations. The case had also influenced federal legislation addressing organized crime targeting of law enforcement personnel. The Law Enforcement Identity Protection Act, passed by Congress, included provisions specifically inspired by Patrick's experience, creating enhanced penalties for criminals who exploit law enforcement officers' identities. Patrick's case demonstrated that law enforcement personnel are increasingly targeted by sophisticated organized crime operations, explained Senator Patricia Williams, who sponsored the federal legislation. We needed stronger protections and penalties, specifically designed to protect those who have served in law enforcement. Professional organizations had used Patrick's experience to develop new standards for ethical conduct and client protection in financial services. The O'Sullivan case changed how we think about professional responsibility when serving law enforcement clients, explained American Institute of CPA's ethics director, Dr. Jennifer Walsh. Patrick's experience taught us that criminals actively seek to exploit professional relationships with law enforcement personnel. Academic institutions continued studying Patrick's case as an example of how organized crime exploits legitimate professional relationships and how law enforcement expertise can be used to investigate and prosecute sophisticated criminal operations. Patrick O'Sullivan's case represents a unique intersection of victimization and investigation, explained criminology professor Dr. Robert Chen at Harvard University. His law enforcement background enabled him to investigate his own victimization more effectively than typical fraud victims. The international impact of Patrick's case had reached organized crime investigation programs worldwide, with law enforcement agencies requesting consultation on identifying and prosecuting similar financial schemes. Organized crime money laundering through professional identity exploitation is a global phenomenon, explained Interpol organized crime analyst Maria Rodriguez. Patrick O'Sullivan's investigation techniques are being adapted by law enforcement agencies internationally. The response from Patrick's law enforcement community had been overwhelmingly supportive, with retired and active officers across New England organizing to protect themselves and colleagues from similar exploitation. The Boston Police Retirement Association had implemented new programs for educating retiring officers about financial fraud risks and providing resources for professional background verification. Patrick's case taught us that our law enforcement backgrounds make us attractive targets for organized crime, explained Association President Michael Murphy. We develop programs to help retiring officers protect themselves from professional exploitation. Other law enforcement agencies throughout New England had adopted similar protection programs, creating a regional network of resources for officers transitioning to retirement. The O'Sullivan case showed us that organized crime specifically targets law enforcement personnel, explained Massachusetts State Police Retirement Coordinator Dr. Patricia Martinez. We needed systematic approaches to protecting our people from professional fraud. The Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association had used Patrick's experience to develop national guidelines for retirement financial planning and professional service verification. Patrick O'Sullivan's case represents every law enforcement officer's nightmare, explained Association Director Thomas Rodriguez. Criminals exploiting our service and reputation for their own gain. His courage in fighting back protects all of us. Professional liability insurance companies had developed specialized coverage for law enforcement personnel to protect against identity theft and professional exploitation. Patrick's case created an entirely new category of insurance risk, explained law enforcement insurance specialist Dr. Jennifer Walsh. We developed products specifically designed to protect law enforcement officers from the type of professional exploitation Patrick experienced. The ongoing support from Patrick's law enforcement community had helped him process the trauma of identity theft while building programs that protected other officers from similar victimization. The Brotherhood took care of me when I needed help, and now we're taking care of each other, Patrick reflected. David thought he could exploit law enforcement officers individually, but he underestimated our collective strength. Today, Patrick O'Sullivan lives peacefully in his Boston home, protected by comprehensive identity monitoring services and served by rigorously vetted financial professionals who understand the unique trust law enforcement officers place in professional relationships. At 61, he has transformed one of the most personal violations possible into a foundation for protecting other law enforcement personnel from organized crime exploitation. The accounting office where David Castellano operated his money laundering scheme now houses the O'Sullivan Foundation offices, where retired law enforcement officers coordinate financial fraud prevention programs that have protected hundreds of officers from professional exploitation. The space that was used to launder mob money now serves as headquarters for protecting those who dedicated their careers to fighting organized crime. David thought my law enforcement background made me a perfect victim, someone with a clean reputation who would trust professional authority without question, Patrick reflects. He assumed I would be passive and compliant, allowing his money laundering operation to continue indefinitely. But he underestimated what 30 years of investigating financial crimes had taught me about recognizing and fighting systematic fraud. David Castellano remains in federal prison, serving his 25-year sentence with no possibility of early release. His organized crime associates received sentences ranging from 8 to 20 years, and the money laundering network was completely dismantled with assets forfeited for victim compensation. As I finish telling you Patrick O'Sullivan's story, I want you to understand something that should concern every person who has served in law enforcement or loves someone who has. Patrick's experience represents a growing trend of organized crime specifically targeting law enforcement personnel for sophisticated financial exploitation. Every month since Patrick's case became public, I receive messages from retired and active law enforcement officers sharing similar experiences. Accountants who seem too eager to serve police clients. Financial advisors who offer special deals for law enforcement personnel. Investment opportunities that sound too good to be true but come with references from other cops. What makes Patrick's story remarkable isn't that organized crime was exploiting law enforcement officers. It's that Patrick had the investigative skills and determination to recognize the scheme and fight back systematically. Most law enforcement financial fraud victims never realize they're being targeted specifically because of their professional background. Patrick O'Sullivan's law enforcement expertise gave him advantages that most financial fraud victims don't have, explains Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who researches organized crime financial operations. He understood money laundering techniques and had the investigative skills to gather evidence effectively. But Patrick's story teaches lessons that any law enforcement officer can apply: the importance of questioning financial arrangements that seem unnecessarily complex, the value of using investigative instincts when professional relationships feel wrong, the power of systematic documentation when challenging criminal exploitation. Consider how David Castellano's scheme specifically targeted law enforcement personnel over 5 years. He advertised his services to retired cops, built a client base of law enforcement officers, and used their clean backgrounds to provide legitimacy for massive money laundering operations. Organized crime has discovered that law enforcement officers make perfect covers for money laundering, explains FBI Organized Crime Director Sarah Kim. Clean backgrounds, legitimate income sources, and trust in professional authority make retired cops ideal victims for financial exploitation. The psychological impact of this targeting extends beyond individual financial losses. When criminals exploit law enforcement officers' service and reputation for illegal purposes, they violate the fundamental principles that officers dedicated their careers to protecting. Having your law enforcement background used for organized crime activities feels like having your entire career perverted, explains trauma counselor Dr. Patricia Martinez, who specializes in law enforcement victims. Officers feel like their service has been turned against everything they believed in. Patrick's systematic response to David's exploitation created a template that other law enforcement officers can follow, but it also revealed how sophisticated organized crime financial operations have become in targeting specific victim populations. Patrick had to become a financial crimes investigator focused on his own case, observes law enforcement advocate Margaret Foster. Most retired officers shouldn't need FBI-level investigation skills to protect themselves from their accountants. The regulatory changes inspired by Patrick's case have strengthened protections for law enforcement personnel, but enforcement remains challenging as organized crime continues developing new techniques for exploiting professional relationships. We're fighting an ongoing battle against increasingly sophisticated criminal targeting of law enforcement officers, explains Massachusetts Law Enforcement Protection Coordinator Michael Torres. Patrick's case taught us about criminal techniques we hadn't previously understood. The most important lesson from Patrick O'Sullivan's experience isn't about organized crime specifically. It's about the necessity of applying law enforcement investigative skills to personal financial protection, even in retirement. Patrick's 30 years of financial crime investigation provided him with knowledge that proved crucial for recognizing and fighting systematic exploitation. Law enforcement officers at all career stages can benefit from understanding how their professional backgrounds make them attractive targets for sophisticated criminals. Patrick's case demonstrates that law enforcement training doesn't end with retirement, explains law enforcement education specialist Dr. Robert Chen. Officers need to continue applying their investigative skills to protect themselves and their families from criminal exploitation. The foundation Patrick established continues growing as more law enforcement officers discover they're not alone in experiencing professional exploitation. The support network he created provides both practical assistance and emotional validation for officers whose trust has been violated by people who should have been protecting their interests. Patrick showed us that law enforcement officers can be more than just victims of organized crime, says Foundation Coordinator Thomas Chen, himself a financial fraud victim. His example gave us tools to fight back and protect other officers. As organized crime becomes more sophisticated in targeting specific populations, law enforcement officers will likely face increasing attempts at financial exploitation. But Patrick's story provides hope that officers can protect themselves and others through systematic application of their investigative skills and refusal to accept professional authority without verification. The most valuable lesson from Patrick O'Sullivan's experience is that law enforcement officers never really retire from fighting crime. They just need to recognize when criminals are targeting them personally and respond with the same systematic approach they use to protect others throughout their careers. Patrick transformed his professional exploitation into professional protection, but every law enforcement officer can apply his investigative approach to safeguarding their own financial security. Trust professionals who welcome questions, provide transparent explanations, and demonstrate consistency between their services and their claims. Remember, your law enforcement background is an asset to be protected, not a vulnerability to be exploited, and the investigative skills you developed during your career are your best defense against those who would abuse your service for their criminal gain.